So in this video, I want to explore the consequences of the thinking mind not becoming just a tool to guide us in reality, but as something has become so arrogant that it's disconnected itself from the source, from actual reality, and what the consequences of that are. And I think that they are really, really important because I think that's what is happening to so many of us. I think it is the original story that Nietzsche told, and McGilchrist took that story about the master and his emissary and related it to the left and right sides of the brain, in the sense that there's a very prosperous kingdom. The king was very kind and generous. The task got so many that he needed an emissary, so he brings on this assistant, and the emissary became very egotistical and finally believed that they no longer needed the master and severed all connections, and then the entire kingdom, all the prosperity reversed itself. And so he told that story about the two sides of the brain, and I totally buy into that, but I also think it's very applicable to the thinking mind and all the symbols that we have brought into this world to represent it, and how those symbols can leave us disconnected if we buy into them rather than using them as a tool. And so when we go back to Advaita Vedanta, so let's go back to Gandhi. It's fascinating that Gandhi talked about truth, an objective truth, a real reality. And for him, this reality was God. And he would use the phrase God is truth or truth is God. But it was absolute that this was a reality beyond our capacity for thought. And thinking captures pieces of it, but it never really captures it. That's why Gandhi said there may never be one religion, because once we start communicating and symbolizing these experiences, they take on a little bit of bias, and they come through in slightly different ways. But behind all the symbolism was the classic, don't confuse the map with the territory. These are clear symbols of experience, but they're not the experience itself. But just putting things in that way suggests that there is a genuine reality. And we've updated this a little bit. So if you listen to teachers like Rupert Spira, he doesn't talk about God necessarily, but he may use the word experience or being or consciousness beyond all of our illusions of thinking. And so there still is some kind of lifeline to this real reality. And if we look at the history of our species, again, I've talked about this major event, the cognitive revolution, where we recognized our thoughts to be symbols of reality. So for the vast majority of human history, we just assumed, as soon as we started thinking impersonated reality, and we just assumed they were accurate reflections. And then it was only in the 60s when we started to define cognitive psychology, thinking, as taking the sensory input and transforming it and editing it and modifying it and influenced by our biases, and then storing that in memory and then using it later. So all of our thoughts about reality were better or worse imitations of the genuine thing. And of course, Baudrillard, who sometimes gets looked at as a postmodernist, but he recognized that we can have simulations, and these are imitations of real things in the real world, and then we can slowly move further and further into this world of simulations until we're dealing with simulacra. And simulacra are thoughts that have no reference to any actual reality. And then we see that all coming to, almost like the pinnacle of the story with postmodernism. Modern just meaning, today's version of postmodernism, because it sounds weird to say modern postmodernism. But, modernism isn't very modern because it goes back to the very beginnings of science. But again, the difference being that modernism is the assumption that there is a reality, and our thoughts can have different degrees of reflecting that accurately. And then we get to postmodernism, which is what I think so many, particularly young people, they've embraced this philosophy, even though they don't know it necessarily. And you wouldn't, because the philosophy is the complete disengagement of thinking representing any kind of reality. It severs that lifeline from thought to reality, and thoughts are suddenly wandering about on this ocean of the abyss, and that's why everything becomes absolutely arbitrary in postmodernism. So when I was lecturing this last week, the students it was so surprising to articulate postmodernism to them, even though they probably felt it culturally. And there's only one truth in postmodernism, and that is there is no truth. And that got quite a surprise from the group, but you can kind of feel that zeitgeist in modern culture, because the emissary, which is the modern thinking mind, has become so arrogant and so convinced of its superiority that it absolutely has severed connections with anything beyond it. And so we are moving into this world of pictures over real events. Virtual money it should be really interesting to see what's going to happen with that, because money, everything used to be so tangible, and then we had things that kind of represented it, like you could say gold represented money, and then we at least had cash, and now money has lost all physicality, and so nothing seems to go back to anything real. And that's not because we've gotten lost in a sense that we know we're lost and we need to find our way back. It's because we've revealed the truth that there is no truth. I think that's a direct quote from postmodernism. The only truth is that there is no truth, and so there is no the way home. We're eternally afloat in the abyss, and that's so different than the very assumptions of Advaita Vedanta and spirituality, at least the way I'm looking at it. And of course, we get drowned in bureaucracy, and I've talked about this in so many other videos, that are just symbols that represent symbols that represent symbols, and that's why for some of us, work can seem so meaningless, because it doesn't tie back into anything real. And remember, the person who is having a panic attack is really having a thought attack. And that's why grounding is so effective with people with having this panic attack, because again, remember the idea: you shift your attention. Tell me 5 things you can see, 5 things you can touch, 5 things you can hear, and it brings the world back to the senses rather than our thoughts about them. Now, again, it's a whole other video to say how much our senses are actual reality, although the idea of sensing without thought is pretty close, even though it may again be slightly imperfect. But I just saw this commercial where I can buy a foot of land in Scotland and call myself a lord, and I'm considering that. Maybe for Father's Day that might be kind of fun, as long as you take it, as a joke, because all the symbolism there. I mean, what does it even mean to own land? I mean, it helps, I think, if we can at least clarify when we're living in the real world and when we're living in this abstract thinking version of it. And certainly buying a foot of land in Scotland and saying that I own it all the way over here in the US, just simply is so absurd. It's got to be kind of funny, right? And so, have we left reality? Well, it's not that we've left reality. It's that the thinking mind has become so arrogant that it no longer accepts the hypothesis of reality. It buys it as a skeptic buys the flat Earth. It finds that reality is so foolish of a hypothesis, it's not even worth considering. And what that does is, along with it, what were the Advaita Vedanta teachers? I mean, what are they grounding our essence in? Again, I see the quest of spirituality virtually impossible if you completely work your ideas around other ideas, which work around other ideas with no reference at all to the real world. I mean, how does metaphors wouldn't work? Even our understanding, our basic definitions. Ultimately, when we define, this is one of the insights of science, is when we define things, we can't just define them with other words, because that takes us on this endless path going nowhere. And that's why we call it an operational definition in science. And all operational definitions are sensory definitions. You define something so someone can see it for themselves. And that gets around our thoughts and brings it back to the real world. So I guess the question is, because I've done other videos, like, do you trust the universe? And I think maybe I should have done this video first. Do you even buy in to the idea of consciousness? That there is some reality beyond our thinking of it?